as an erosion management approach. Educated at Brown, Yale, and the University of Chicago, Shabica is president of Shabica and Associates, Inc. Coastal Scientists and Engineers, is Emeritus Professor of Earth Science at Northeastern Illinois University, and is president of the Great Lakes Shore and Beach Preservation Association. He specializes in design, engineering, and monitoring of Great Lakes sustainable shore protection systems with emphasis on beach, wetland, and ravine preservation. His research, sponsored by the Great Lakes Commission, Illinois DNR, NOAA, and USGS, includes performance of shore protection structures, beach and ravine stabilization, littoral drift sand surveys, reduction of non-point source pollution, and restoration and management of coastal wetlands. Please help me introduce.
First of all, I'd like to thank Heather and Shannon for getting us all together. But I also want to put a plug in for ASBPA, and you see it up there. And Shore and Beach, it's a wonderful way to find out what other people are doing. And it also brings together biologists, geologists, engineers, scientists, and politicians, regulators. And one of the things that impressed me about this invitation was the variety of folks that showed up. So let's take a look at some of the slides. Evolution. We've studied the Great Lakes ecosystem, and it's evolving. We don't know what the future is, but the plan is to design and engineer systems that will make that evolutionary process sustainable for us. We know where they came from. So I'm going to take a quick look at rocky shores, sand plains, and clay bluffs. And the history of the beaches in the Great Lakes, as we know, and Pete really put his finger on it, we're talking about erosion. And the materials came from the erosion of the rocky bluffs, clay bluffs, rivers. And then human beings came along. And as we all know, some consider us invasives. So we've modified the lake shores. And the question is, can we accommodate what's happened to the lake shores, and can we, I don't want to call it, go back to the original Garden of Eden, but can we make this into a garden that's sustainable and isn't going to break the bank? And one of the critical things and critical problems that I see is, how do we fund a lot of these wonderful plans that we've already heard about? So, northern upper Great Lakes, Lake Superior. Natural bays, natural bay beaches. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful example for the rest of the lake shores. So there's several areas that I'd like to take a look at in the next 20 minutes. Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, and how many people are from the Buffalo district here? Okay, I'm proud of you. Illinois Beach State Park, and then Lakeview Wildlife Management Area in New York, I know not much about, but was really impressed by what I've learned about it in the last several weeks, having been invited to this conference. And then eroding cohesive clay bluffs with ephemeral beaches. Lake is high, there's usually not much of a beach there. Lake is low, you may see a narrow beach. And there are several areas that we'll take a look at. Lake Michigan, Illinois North Shore, and it's called the North Shore. It's really not the North Shore of Lake Michigan. It's the North Shore just north of the city of Chicago. Lake Erie South Shore and Lake Ontario South Shore. And then lastly, I'm going to put a plug in for lake fills. And they would be municipal lake fills like Toronto and Chicago. There's some places where sometimes you can actually get crazy and go out into the lake and create incredible incredible ecosystems that are sustainable. So, Presque Isle. Harbor over here. How long has that harbor been there and used? In the Revolutionary War, that harbor was an active harbor. And the Corps of Engineers, for a long time, worked at stabilizing it to prevent breaches in this sand spit that supplied updrift from sand probably around, somewhere around maybe under natural conditions, 160,000 cubic yards a year. Tried all kinds of things. Groins, seawalls, and in 1992 completed a series of nearshore. Oh, and we should make it clear the difference between nearshore and offshore. Do we all agree that nearshore is the zone where waves break, and offshore is out beyond the zone where waves break? Is that? Anyway, that's what I'm going to use. So nearshore means you're building something within the surf zone. Offshore is you're building something outside of the surf zone. The surf zone is where the waves break, where wave height is affected by water depth. Completed in '92, it's sustainable, but it requires regular sand nourishment because the updrift, and we can blame Pennsylvania for this, since they're not here. Updrift to this area is urban lakeshore where a lot of the bluffs that supplied sand to the beaches are no longer eroding. And there are also other harbors there that have blocked sand moving along shore. So the natural littoral drift was way over 100,000 yards a year. And I apologize to Pete because he talks about cubic meters, but that's the difference between Canada and us poor types. We never did go metric, Pete. Right now, as of today, the Corps of Engineers has determined it takes about 35,000 yards a year to maintain this system. That's a lot less than the natural system. So these breakwaters that are about 150 feet long, about 250 feet offshore, so they're pretty far offshore, and a lot of the littoral drift sand they planned, designed this well, and Joan Pope, as we all know, was at the Buffalo District, was critical in designing this thing. So littoral drift sand moves inside and outside of these breakwaters. So they're pretty far offshore, but they're still in the near shore. So the amount of sand necessary to be paid for by the government, 35,000 yards a year, it's underfunded. They're doing maybe 32,000 yards a year. Another sandy coast. This one is in Illinois. This is Illinois Beach State Park. It's a sand plain that's moving from north to south. It's relict. It's been there for a long time. But updrift armoring in Wisconsin, we can blame the guys from Wisconsin, and you can see updrift here, has caused erosion. I shouldn't say has caused erosion, has reduced the amount of material coming along shore under natural conditions. It's probably around 100,000 yards a year, kind of like at Presque Isle. That has been reduced a lot, but also the state of Illinois built a marina up there. So the marina has a certain level of impact on it too. But to sustain this wonderful ecosystem of dunes and swales, you can see these dunes and swales here, all kinds of incredible native species that live here. This is what's known as the Dead River. I don't know why they called it the Dead River, but this is what Chicago looked like 200 years ago. It was a low sand plain, and with a river that flowed from north to south and then flowed into the lake and then gets pushed around because of lake storms. Anyway, to sustain this, we can back pass sand from the south end of this sand plain, which is several miles long, to the updrift or north end of it, and it's not a lot. It's about 80,000 yards a year. sadly underfunded. So here's the beach nourishment project. Get a nice beach up there, sand moves to the south. The next year, the state doesn't have any money. State of Illinois, I don't want to say I'm ashamed. All right, so Lakeview Wildlife Management Area, and I gotta tell you, Lake Ontario has got a lot of great stuff, and you ought to be proud to have this incredible bunch of great coastal systems to work with. If you look at the Illinois lakeshore, it's basically straight, but it once looked like this. Imagine the city of Chicago on top of this. That's essentially what happened in Chicago. So, I'm not sure about the sustainability, but what we see, and Pete talked about this, is over time, these things fill with sand, and ultimately, because this is sort of a drowned valley as the lake went up, these will fill with sand. How do you manage that? Do you just let it go? Don't know. But they're working on the 2014 plan by the IJC. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing how this works out. So there are issues, ecosystem, incredible refuge. You need to control the invasives, and because we're invasives, sometimes there are ways of dealing with the invasives that not just pulling them out. We talked about pelletizing Phragmites. There's some really cool things you can do with the invasives. Generally, the beaches require regular beach nourishment or sand bypassing, unless, in many cases, erosion is not an issue. And there are certainly plenty of open Great Lakes coasts where erosion, which we know is the natural process, you let the lake go, and you have that stable ecosystem then of an eroding bluff plant community with spectacular things growing on it, like buffalo berry and Juniperus communis, that really low juniper. Lots of great species, but again, we have this pressure, and oh boy. Do you know who Goldman Sachs is? Okay, what we've seen is an increase in the number of Great Lakes properties purchased by Goldman Sachs employees, because they understand that buying a great piece of property in Cape Hatteras may not be as smart as buying a great piece of property on the Great Lakes, because our climatologists see the future of the Great Lakes in terms of extreme conditions, lake levels, sea level going higher, not the kind of problem they face on the marine coasts. So Presque Isle, it's underfunded. Illinois Beach Park, unfunded. Lakeview Wildlife Management Area, a wonderful place. I'd like to put a plug in again for ASBPA and Shoreline Beach. In an article published in 2011, I talked about a thing called the sand bank. On Martha's Vineyard, they have a thing called the land bank. Anybody familiar with the land bank? When a coastal piece of property changes hands, 2% of that sale price goes into the land bank, and this organization uses that money specifically to take care of those open areas. If we could have a sand bank concept, either statewide or community-wide, where there was a source of money, whether it was from taxes or the sale of real estate, we would be able to fund some of these projects that are now underfunded. And it's not a lot of money, but the agencies, whether state or federal, are having a rough go with money. So I would really like to push the concept of a sand bank, whether it's somebody buys a piece of property on the lakeshore, and we know how much sand would be contributed by that eroding property. You can just say, assume a number of like 1.5 feet a year or something like that. Part of their tax could be money that goes into the sand bank as opposed to just purchasing or getting that 2% of the sale price of a property. So there are ways that politically there can be funding for sustaining these lake shores that I think is really important. Because right now we see the municipalities and the states and the federal government having a rough go. Private property owners generally are able to maintain their properties. But every time somebody stabilizes a piece of lakeshore, they're reducing the amount of sediment that would have eroded out of that lakeshore into the system. I think they ought to pay for it. And I'm glad none of my clients are here. Right? Okay. No, actually, my clients, if I've talked about this with all of my private clients, they all think it's a good idea. Because in the global scheme of their property value, that's going to make their property values go up, which is what they observed on Martha's Vineyard. They had a terrible time passing this there. It was the county, Dukes County did it. There's a lot of resistance. Oh, I don't want that money to go into something like that. Now that we have it, they have it, they're all happy as larks. All right, so let's look at the eroding bluffs and ephemeral beaches. Lake is low, and I'm sure you recognize this section of Lakeshore and Lake Ontario. When the lake is low, typically narrow beaches. When the lake is high, no beach. This is not always the case. Sometimes there's going to be a beach there regardless, and you have an actively eroding bluff that supports a native plant community, and you notice there aren't any trees on there, but there are all kinds of nifty native plants on those bluffs. So what we see, and you've heard it already, but I'm going to repeat it again, we've lost a lot of sand from the system, not only because of armoring the shore, where those bluffs would have contributed sand to the system, depending on the level of sand in the bluffs. In Illinois, it's only about 15%. Other places it's higher, other places it's lower. In Michigan, lots of the sand comes down the rivers. But then, and since we've got the Genesee River here, I'd just like to put in a plug for the EPA and you folks working on this, because it's an area of concern, get the water quality in that river straightened out. And what is it, like a 160-mile long river? And again, we can blame Pennsylvania for part of it. So we have a sediment-starved, a sand-starved lakeshore, where, as Pete talked about earlier, there's the potential littoral drift along a shore. You know, what the waves can move, like, let's just say $100,000 a year, or 100,000 yards a year, yards a year, where the actual littoral drift might be only 10,000 yards a year. What that means is there's not enough sand in the system, and his drawing showing that lake bed erosion being accelerated is really a critical issue in the Great Lakes, because it's similar to rising sea level. It's irreversible. Yeah, and there's the consequence of no action. Imagine a real estate lady standing there and saying, "Sir, do you like diving?" So, we've learned a lot from the Illinois lakeshore. It's one of the shortest lake shores in the Great Lakes. What state has the longest lakeshore in the Great Lakes? Michigan. It's like 2,300 miles. Of the states in the United States, there's only one state that has longer shoreline: Alaska. So Michigan, a lot of the test cases about public trusts and all of that have taken place in Michigan, because those poor guys have such a long lakeshore to deal with. Anyway, the nice thing about Illinois is we've been at it a long time. So, Chicago built its jetties in the 1830s. A guy named Streeter, Colonel Streeter, Captain Streeter, built his house on the sand fillet that built up immediately after they built the North Breakwater. It's called Streeterville in Chicago now. But people learned that, wow, if you stick something out into the lake, and this picture is from 1897, if you stuck a structure out in the lake, and these are all piers, they're rock-filled crib piers, my gosh, they seem to hold sand. And you see, we still have the eroding bluffs, but over time, either the structures failed or the bluffs stabilized if they continued to maintain those structures. This is a picture taken from 1910. Bluffs are stabilized. You can see there are trees now growing on the bluffs, but still there's really not much beach there because of the structures. When they built those, and these are groins, it'd be a jetty if it was at the mouth of a harbor with a river coming into it where the water is jetted in and out of the harbor, either by tides or changing lake levels or river flow. So some people call them jetties, but they're groins. When they built these, they didn't fill them up with sand. So over time, the sand continued to go away, and all this nifty structures, the village of Kenilworth, one of the richest communities in the United States, had their boat club built out on a beach. And every picture I've ever seen of the boat club, it looks brand new. And I commented to one of the folks in Kenilworth Historical Society, wow, they really maintained that. She said, no, they built it and it was destroyed the next year. So anytime I see pictures of structures on beaches in Illinois, they're all brand new. So in the late 80s, we got a grant with the U.S. Geological Survey and Sea Grant, God bless you Sea Grant people, to study the thickness of sand deposits in Illinois and Indiana to see, when we talk about the system being sediment starved, how much sand is actually there. So we have this thing called a hydraulic probe, which we basically just blasted through the sand down to either clay or cobble, surveyed it from land. This was in the old days where we didn't have very fancy GPS working for us. But anyway, we were able to do it. And what we saw was, on the North Shore, this is a cross-section of the lake shore. This is lake bed clay till. There's a little teeny bit of sand. This location was in Lake Bluff, Illinois. A little bit of offshore sand, but basically eroding clay. And if you look at Google Earth photos of Lake Ontario, you'll see places where you see plumes of clay in the water. That clay is either from the eroding bluff or from the eroding lake bed. Illinois Beach Park, on the other hand, very nice thick blanket of sand offshore. Nonetheless, it's still it's becoming sediment starved because the sand coming into that system has been reduced by updrift shore armoring. So even though there's plenty of sand there, it's going away as well. So in Illinois, after 100 years, most of the groins were no longer effective because where did that sand go? Ultimately, it goes offshore. And whether it was in the old days when sand was considered a nuisance to the navigational community, where it's just dumped in deeper water, the littoral drift system moves sand along shore, but some of that sand goes offshore as well. So we see, as we all know, sand is going away in the lakes. All right, so, oh boy, fishermen, northern end of the lakes, we see these wonderful rocky headlands with pocket beaches. Baird, back in the late 80s, engineered a pocket beach for the city of Lake Forest. And it was the first pocket beach system in Illinois. And there was a huge hue and cry. Oh my gosh, this is going to ruin everything. So it's hydraulically modeled. And by the way, those of us who design and engineer shore protection systems, the first thing you'd want to do is study intently every similar structure nearby to see how they performed, and that's called studying the prototype. There were no prototypes. So what did Baird do? They did a physical hydraulic model in Ottawa. I went up there, it was lots of fun, and designed this system where the structures are kind of far offshore. They're about 400 feet offshore. But it performed precisely the way the hydraulic model said. Pete, do you remember how many cubic yards of sand or cubic meters of sand went into that? Probably more than 11,000 cubic meters of sand. A lot of sand. What did I say, 11,000? I mean over 100,000. So they filled it with sand. It trapped a little bit of sand just at the north end of the structure, 10,000 yards. They placed it to the south. And there was incredible anxiety on the communities. And if you have that Shore and Beach issue from 2008 that talks about the Illinois experiment, there's a cartoon in there, and I didn't make a copy of it, basically implying that the poor folks to the south, downdrift of this structure, were screwed. Well, it turned out that it was fine. And there was no measurable, and there still is no measurable impact by the system on the littoral drift system in Illinois. So we had this groundbreaking, followed by lots more structures. So this is in Lake Bluff, Illinois. This is the water treatment plant here. This is their yacht club. Really more of a shed than a yacht club. Anyway, we designed a pocket beach for them. Here's the yacht club, and now they have a little beach house there. And the state now requires us to overfill these structures by 20%. Back in those days, we were just required to fill it up. Overfill, what the overfill does, it's almost like Trout Unlimited. We calculate how much sand's going to be trapped on the north side of this. You can see this little fillet of sand trapped on the south side of it as well. So when we build them, we put that sand in first, but what we know is the sand that's moving along shore, we may have interfered with the sandbars out there, so that 20% overfill is kind of an assurance that we didn't screw up. Plus, the state requires us to monitor it for a minimum of 5 years. So after 20 years of monitoring, about 2% of the original fill added annually was our estimate. It's turned out to be a little bit less than that, because remember, even though you have a beach here and it's protected by a breakwater or a groin, there's still some sand loss to the offshore. So even if you have a beach that's protected with a structure, it's still going to need sand maintenance, but not a heck of a lot. As we learned from the open breakwaters on Presque Isle, where if it were open, it would be between 120 and 160,000 yards a year. It's down to 35,000 yards. This was considered the worst property in the state of Illinois by the Illinois State coastal geologist Charlie Collinson at the time. This was just downdrift of the Sunrise Park Beach. You can see old seawalls here. There was once a groin here. The natural bluff erosion eroded the shoreline back about 50 feet there. It's a horrible piece of property. We were asked to restore that, and this was a tricky one. So we asked Cy Galvin. Who knows Cy Galvin? Remember Cy from the Army Corps of Engineers, an old timer, was one of the authors of the U.S. Army Shore Protection Manual, a really great guy. We flew him out, said, oh yeah, this is terrific. So it's a wonderful opportunity. So he helped us design and engineer it. There's a ravine up here. This is the neighbor's property here. So the owner's property is right here, stops right about here, but to assure that the neighbor had a nice little beach there, we also put a little spur breakwater in there. and that's been fine since it was built. Another one in Winnetka, Illinois, 300-foot long revetment. Water about, at average lake level 579, about 4 to 5 feet in front of that structure. Replaced that with a pocket beach, planted it with native species. What's the favorite beach grass in the Great Lakes? What species? Marram grass. Anybody recognize this grass? Oh man, here's a problem. And that is, if you have a landscaper involved, oh, we're running out of time. If you have a landscaper involved, they might want to plant some other non-native grass. How much time have we got? Oh, we're done? Okay. Okay, let's finish up. Problems in Lake Ontario, long groins, probably a little bit too long. So we want to study those prototypes. Port Union, Ontario, structures built in 2002, nicely functional. So the issues, design them carefully, make sure there's that 20% overfill, and the regulatory issues in the state of Illinois. The state owns the land under the structure. The Army Corps of Engineers, and this is Chicago District, requires the owner to maintain that structure. The public has access to that beach. So the owner, required to maintain it, the state owns the land under the structure, and beach walkers can walk on the beach. Thank you. Questions? Okay, yeah, I'll repeat the questions. Sir, Jay.
How do you monitor whether your pocket beach and associated structures are actually bypassing the sand, or do you just set up a system where you know you're going to have to bypass it from the updrift side to the downdrift side?
Okay, the question is, how do we know it's bypassing the sand? First of all, the structures, the state will not allow us to build a structure in a water or more than 125 feet offshore. It's well within the surf zone. So we see the sandbars going around the structure, and the properties to the south, for maybe the width of the structure you put in, see an accretion of sand. And that's why we're required, when we calculate the sand quantities, all of the sand that this is going to affect in the system, we have to put in beforehand. Not only in the structure, updrift of the structure, downdrift of the structure. We monitor that area for 5 years to see if there's any effect on the system, and so far we haven't seen it. Wow, no more questions. Oh, ma'am. Gotcha. The question is, do we just build them in eroding areas, or are there depositional areas to the south? There are no depositional areas to the south of these structures. These structures were all built on basically 100% engineered lakeshore in Illinois. So there are seawalls and revetments updrift as well as downdrift. If there were an area of deposition like a sand spit to the south, we really want to make sure that this bypass sand. But keeping them close to shore, the sand bypasses them. The trick is when you build them farther offshore, like 300, 400, 500 feet offshore, they tend to have a greater effect on the littoral drift system. And most importantly, you don't walk away from them. They still need sand periodically. Sir, in the back.
Yeah, Scudder, you've presented the most number of examples I've ever seen of either offshore groins or breakwaters, segmented breakwaters. In all of the examples that you're familiar with, they're all basically just rock. rock groin, rock. Has there ever been an attempt in the design of those to incorporate some more natural features, like what we saw in Tim DePriest's presentation earlier?
Sure, a great question. What the gentleman said was, gosh, do you just use rocks out there or do you try to incorporate plants? The problem is where we're working is an incredibly high energy area, and plants have been tried and they wash away. So when you have a high energy sediment starved area where design waves in the deep water are say 23 feet high, unfortunately we can't put plants along the shore. But what we do is make sure that when we build that beach we get plenty of beach grass. One of my favorites is sea rocket or seaside spurge. Sir?
You talked in many of your examples about the amount of sand replenishment over time. And I wonder whether, from your professional experience, whether there's a change in perspective in terms of the sustainability of these kind of projects, such that you don't have to do replenishment. Is that something that's now seen as unsustainable after you replenish the sand?
Yeah, the question is it possible to have a beach that you don't have to replenish the sand? The answer is sure, if it's a place where sand is accreting, but that sand is coming from somewhere else. So, like Long Point on the north side of Lake Ontario, you got lots of sand accretion there, but the supply of that sand is being cut off. So I see if we want to have those natural areas of sand, because most of the shores of the Great Lakes are not accreting but eroding, you need to supply that sand somehow. And the good thing is a lot of the Great Lakes states have vast expanses of outwash plain sand deposits from the glaciers. So there's plenty of sand there. Thank you. While you're changing this, I just wanted to put in a plug for lake fills, Chicago, Toronto, New York City. At the foot of the Battery in Manhattan, the water is shallow. It's between, say, 20 and 30 feet deep. They could build a lake fill there where the elevation of that land is higher. I wouldn't call it a lake fill, though. We'd call it a sea fill. That might provide the kind of shore protection that the city of Chicago had, where the water level was just basically at the level of the city. City of Chicago's lakefront now is about 15 feet higher than it was. Thank you.